What if the most profound spiritual breakthrough you've been desperately seeking has been hidden in plain sight for nearly a century, locked away in the whispered conversations between a persecuted Chinese minister and his most devoted followers? In the shadowy corners of a war-torn China, while bombs fell and persecution raged, one man discovered a fasting discipline so transformative, so dangerous to the religious establishment, that he dared share it only with those who had proven their absolute commitment to the deepest mysteries of faith. This wasn't just another spiritual practice. This was a gateway to a dimension of spiritual authority that most believers never even dream exists. A secret so powerful that it could either elevate a soul to unprecedented intimacy with the divine or completely shatter everything they thought they knew about walking with God. Brother Watchman Nee lived through the most turbulent period in modern Chinese history, watching as everything familiar crumbled around him while he pressed deeper into spiritual territories that few humans have ever explored. Imprisoned for over 20 years by the communist regime, stripped of his freedom, his ministry, and ultimately his life, this man possessed something that no earthly power could touch. A connection to eternal realities that burned brighter in the darkness of his prison cell than it ever had in the comfort of religious gatherings. During his final decades of freedom, before the iron doors of persecution closed forever, Nee made a decision that would echo through generations. He would entrust his deepest revelations about fasting and spiritual breakthrough only to those disciples whose hearts had been proven in the furnace of absolute surrender. The disciples who received this sacred knowledge weren't chosen for their theological brilliance or their ministerial success, but for something far rarer: their willingness to embrace the terrifying beauty of complete spiritual abandonment. These were men and women who had already demonstrated that they would rather die than compromise the purity of their devotion. Souls who understood that the greatest treasures of the kingdom are never handed to the casual seeker, but only to those who approach the throne of grace with trembling reverence and unshakable faith. What Nee shared with them in those hushed, sacred moments wasn't merely a technique or a religious discipline, but a pathway into the very heart of divine mystery. A fasting practice that went beyond abstaining from food to embrace a form of spiritual hunger that could literally rewire the human soul's capacity to commune with the eternal. This secret fasting method didn't promise easy victories or quick spiritual highs, but something infinitely more valuable: a complete transformation of one's inner being that would make the practitioner a living bridge between heaven and earth. Those who embraced this discipline found themselves experiencing not just answered prayers or supernatural encounters, but a fundamental shift in their spiritual DNA, a metamorphosis so profound that they began to carry the very presence of God in ways that defied human explanation. Their fasting became a form of worship so pure, so consuming, that it literally rewrote their spiritual genetics, creating within them a capacity for divine intimacy that most believers spend entire lifetimes seeking but never find. Today, for the first time, the veil is being lifted on this closely guarded secret, not because it has become less sacred, but because the spiritual hunger of this generation has finally reached the depth of desperation that makes such revelation not just appropriate, but absolutely necessary. What you're about to discover will challenge every assumption you've ever held about fasting, prayer, and spiritual breakthrough, revealing why true disciples throughout history have always known that the greatest treasures of faith are hidden not in plain sight, but in the secret chambers of absolute consecration, where only the truly hungry dare to enter. The first secret that transformed Nee's understanding of spiritual fasting lay in recognizing that the initial 72 hours create what can only be described as the spiritual awakening of true hunger. During the first day, Practitioners experience an unexpected surge of mental clarity and spiritual sensitivity, as if removing food from their daily routine had somehow sharpened their capacity to distinguish between the voice of God and the constant chatter of their own thoughts. This isn't mere physical discomfort, but the beginning of a profound spiritual recalibration where the soul starts to recognize how much of its normal satisfaction has been derived from external sources rather than genuine divine communion. The second and third days bring what many describe as the most crucial phase of the entire discipline, a period when physical weakness begins to expose the shallow roots of conventional Christian experience, revealing how dependent most believers have become upon comfortable religious routines for their sense of spiritual vitality. Day 2 typically produces unexpected emotional responses: tears of repentance for years of spiritual mediocrity, anger at religious systems that promised much but delivered little, and always and growing desperation for something more authentic than anything previously experienced. By the third day, the combination of physical hunger and spiritual emptiness creates a crisis point that forces practitioners to choose between abandoning their fast or entering a realm of complete dependence upon divine grace that most Christians never experience in practical reality. Those who persevere through this initial breaking point discover that Day 4 marks a supernatural transition when the spiritual crisis suddenly gives way to an unexpected infusion of divine strength and peace that seems to come from an entirely different dimension of reality. The physical hunger remains intense, but it becomes accompanied by a corresponding spiritual fullness that creates a form of communion with God beyond all previous religious categories and expectations. By the end of the first week, practitioners report their first supernatural encounters, prophetic dreams, divine visions, or direct revelations that provide both encouragement for the journey ahead and specific guidance for navigating the deeper phases of transformation that await them in territories of spiritual experience that few believers ever explore. The second week of this sacred discipline reveals the most closely guarded secret of spiritual authority, that days 8 through 10 produce a complete rewiring of the practitioner's capacity for divine communion, creating what can only be described as a permanent expansion of their spiritual sensitivity and supernatural awareness. On the 8th day, many report experiencing what feels like a second spiritual birth, as if the week of preparation had created within them a qualitatively different capacity for heart-to-heart intimacy with God that bypasses all normal channels of religious expression. This isn't emotional experience or religious excitement, but a measurable transformation in their ability to maintain conscious awareness of God's presence throughout daily activities. Days 9 and 10 bring the manifestation of genuine spiritual authority, when the combination of prolonged physical weakness and intensified divine communion begins to produce supernatural empowerment that manifests in unprecedented prayer effectiveness, prophetic insights that prove accurate and transformative, and an atmosphere of God's presence that produces conviction and breakthrough in others without conscious effort or manipulation. Practitioners discover that their weeks of consecration and emptying have created within them a capacity to exercise spiritual influence that exceeds anything available through conventional ministry training, producing demonstrable results that shock even the practitioners themselves as they witness divine power flowing through their prayers and words. The completion of the second week establishes what becomes a permanent baseline of spiritual authority and divine intimacy that serves as the foundation for even greater revelations in the final phase of the discipline. By day 14, most practitioners report having become fundamentally different people, not just spiritually renewed, but transformed in their essential capacity to commune with God, minister to others, and navigate spiritual challenges with a confidence and effectiveness that appears almost supernatural to those who knew them before their fasting journey began. They have discovered that authentic spiritual authority cannot be learned through study or developed through religious effort, but only received through complete consecration that ventures far beyond the safe boundaries of conventional Christian experience. The most revolutionary aspect of this ancient fasting method lies in understanding the precise spiritual dynamics that occur within the human soul during each of the first 7 days, creating a systematic pathway to divine breakthrough that has been tested and proven by hidden practitioners throughout church history. Day 1 produces the stirring of holy discontent, when the absence of food awakens a corresponding spiritual hunger that makes practitioners acutely aware of how much of their normal spiritual satisfaction has been derived from external sources rather than genuine communion with God, often producing surprising energy and mental clarity, as if the decision to fast had released them from subtle spiritual bondages they hadn't even realized were limiting their capacity for divine intimacy. Days 2 through 4 create what can only be described as the crisis of authentic consecration, when continued physical abstinence begins to expose the shallow roots of much conventional Christian experience, while simultaneously forcing practitioners to choose between abandoning their discipline or entering complete dependence upon divine grace. Day 2 typically brings unexpected emotional responses and growing desperation for something more authentic than previous religious experience, while Day 3 marks the breaking point of natural strength, creating a spiritual crisis that either qualifies practitioners for experiences beyond conventional Christian living or forces them to abandon their pursuit of deeper spiritual reality. Day 4 produces a supernatural transition when the spiritual crisis gives way to an influx of divine strength and peace from an entirely different dimension of spiritual reality. Days 5 through 7 establish the foundation for everything that follows, with Day 5 typically marking the beginning of diminished physical hunger replaced by intensified spiritual hunger that makes practitioners aware of dimensions of divine reality never before perceived. Days 6 and 7 bring the first supernatural encounters, prophetic dreams, divine visions, direct revelations that provide both encouragement and specific guidance for the deeper transformations ahead. By the end of this first week, practitioners have crossed an invisible threshold that qualifies them for spiritual experiences and divine encounters, simply not available to those who remain within the comfortable boundaries of conventional religious practice. Having discovered that authentic spiritual breakthrough requires venturing into territories that most believers never even know exist. The 8th day marks a profound transition, when practitioners move beyond preparation into direct participation in what can only be described as divine intimacy beyond religious categories, a realm of spiritual experience that cannot be accessed through conventional methods, regardless of their sincerity or consistency. Many report experiencing what feels like a second spiritual birth, as if the week of preparation had created within them a capacity for communion with God that is qualitatively different from anything in their previous Christian experience, producing heart-to-heart intimacy with the divine that bypasses all normal channels of religious expression and creates direct, sustained contact with divine presence that remains accessible regardless of external circumstances or environmental distractions. Days 9 through 11 produce the manifestation of genuine spiritual authority, when prolonged physical weakness combined with intensified divine communion creates supernatural empowerment that manifests in unprecedented prayer effectiveness, prophetic insights that prove accurate and transformative, and an atmosphere of God's presence that produces conviction and breakthrough in others without conscious effort. This phase often brings what practitioners describe as the revelation of hidden mysteries, when spiritual sensitivity created by prolonged fasting unlocks prophetic insights, divine revelations, and supernatural understanding of complex spiritual truths that provide practical knowledge for effective ministry, exceeding anything available through conventional theological training, proving their authenticity through remarkable results when applied in real ministry situations. Days 12 through 14 establish what becomes a permanent sacred space within practitioners, where divine communion occurs regardless of external circumstances, creating constant access to spiritual resources, supernatural guidance, and transformative power that remains available even after the fasting period concludes. By the 14th day, practitioners report that prayer has become less about specific requests and more about sustained fellowship with God's presence, as if their hearts had become literal dwelling places for divine intimacy. They have discovered that authentic spiritual authority comes not through religious technique or ministerial training, but through complete consecration that creates within them a capacity to exercise divine power and spiritual influence that appears almost impossible to those who knew them in their former state of conventional Christian living. The 15th day represents entry into what can only be described as direct participation in the divine nature itself, a realm of spiritual experience so profound that it can only be sustained by souls thoroughly prepared through intensive consecration and spiritual discipline. Practitioners report experiencing union with Christ that transcends theological understanding or emotional experience, producing identification with divine love and purpose that literally rewrites their spiritual DNA and creates capacities for ministry and spiritual authority that seem almost impossible to those who knew them in their previous state. This isn't religious mysticism or emotional experience, but practical transformation that produces measurable results in their ability to minister healing, deliverance, and breakthrough to others, while maintaining depth of spiritual authority that commands respect, even from those who oppose their message. Days 16 through 18 bring the manifestation of resurrection life, when the spiritual death and emptying of previous weeks suddenly give way to an influx of divine power and authority that transforms practitioners into living vessels of supernatural breakthrough and miraculous intervention. During this period, their prayers begin producing immediate and dramatic results. Their prophetic insights prove accurate and transformative, and their very presence carries an atmosphere of divine authority that brings healing, deliverance, and spiritual breakthrough without conscious effort or ministry technique. Many receive detailed commissioning visions that reveal their specific calling and ministry destiny, along with supernatural guidance about how to steward the spiritual authority they have received and use their transformed capacity for maximum kingdom impact. Days 19 through 21 complete the sacred cycle, permanently establishing the transformative work within practitioners and creating lasting changes in their spiritual capacity that continue producing fruit long after their intensive fasting concludes. The 21st day represents what can only be called divine graduation, a profound sense of having completed a spiritual curriculum that qualifies them for ministry opportunities and responsibilities completely beyond their previous capacity. The transition back to normal eating requires careful integration that preserves spiritual gains while reintroducing normal activities, with successful practitioners emerging as permanently transformed vessels who operate with consistent spiritual authority and divine communion, regardless of external circumstances. Having discovered an entirely new way of existing as followers of Christ, living simultaneously in natural and supernatural realms with grace and effectiveness, that commands respect from both spiritual and earthly authorities. The 21-day fasting secret that Watchman Nee guarded so carefully wasn't merely about abstaining from food. It was about discovering that within every believer lies a dormant capacity for divine intimacy and supernatural authority that can only be awakened through the systematic breaking of every earthly attachment and the deliberate cultivation of desperate spiritual hunger. Each day of this sacred discipline serves as another step deeper into the heart of God, where day 1 awakens true spiritual discontent. Days 2 and 3 create the crisis of authentic consecration. Day 4 brings the first taste of supernatural grace, and by day 7, the practitioner has crossed an invisible threshold into territories of divine encounter that most Christians never even know exist. The second week transforms this foundation into genuine spiritual authority, while the final 7 days consummate the journey with permanent union with Christ that produces lasting ministry effectiveness and unshakable divine communion that continues long after the fast concludes. Yet as you've listened to these ancient secrets unfold, a question burns in the depths of your spirit. How long will you continue living in the shallow waters of conventional Christianity when the deep places of God's heart are calling your name with increasing urgency? Every day you delay beginning this transformative journey is another day you remain trapped in spiritual mediocrity, settling for religious experiences that satisfy the mind, but leave the soul still hungry, still yearning, still knowing that there must be something more authentic, more powerful, more life-changing than anything you've yet discovered in your walk with God. The disciples who received this sacred knowledge didn't hesitate or make excuses. They recognized the treasure being offered and paid whatever price was necessary to possess it, understanding that some opportunities for spiritual breakthrough come only once in a lifetime and disappear forever for those who choose comfort over consecration. This moment represents your invitation into a fellowship of hidden saints throughout history who dared to venture beyond the safe boundaries of religious respectability into the dangerous beauty of complete abandonment to divine love. But the decision is yours, and it must be made now, before the fire of spiritual hunger in your heart grows cold and you settle back into the numbing rhythm of spiritual normalcy that keeps millions of believers trapped in perpetual spiritual infancy. If this message has stirred something deep within your spirit, if you recognize that you were born for more than mediocre Christianity, then don't let this moment pass without taking action. Like this video if it has opened your eyes to possibilities you never knew existed. Share it with others who are desperate enough to pay the price for authentic spiritual transformation. Subscribe to join a community of believers who refuse to settle for anything less than the fullness of God's presence in their lives. And leave a comment sharing which day of the 21-day journey resonates most powerfully with your current spiritual hunger. Because your breakthrough begins the moment you stop being a spectator and start being a participant in the ancient secrets that have the power to transform ordinary believers into extraordinary vessels of divine authority.